Okay, YMPE at 51.1. It's just a new issue. This will go up every year. One of the things that I'd like to reiterate here is that the YMPE has two effects for specified employees. And I see a lot of accountants mix this up, and I'm always amazed. But it is confusing. That 5 times YMPE for 2013 is 255,500, meaning the first 255,500 that a specified employee, any employee who owns 10% or more of any class of stock, or anyone related to them by blood marriage or adoption, spends on SR&ED a year, we get credits. So if I pay the owner-manager $500,000 in salary, and he's 100% R&D, I get to deduct $500,000, but I only get credits on the first 255,500. If he's $500,000 in wages, and he's only 50% R&D, then he's only got 250,000. I get credits on the whole thing. Okay? But this is the most for an owner-manager, a specified employee, 10% or more of any class of stock of the company, that we can get credits on. What gets confused here, I find, is there's two limits. The limit for R&D wages that you can claim, and then the second limit is for something called the salary base. The salary base is what you multiply by 65 or 60% to get the proxy amount. The limit on this employee for the salary base is 2.5 times YMP, so it's exactly half of that. I've seen situations where people get confused and they think that this limit applies here as well, so they'll cap the guy here at the 2.5 times YMP, which is incorrect. Again, it's needlessly confusing, I would say, but one of those things that's in there. Okay? So the big problem here is with a specified employee, for salary and wages, everything in sections 5 to 8 of the income tax is in. Any bonus is out. So at the end of the year, if I want to bonus my client down to $500,000 and give him a $500,000 bonus, none of that's going to count for SR&ED. Whereas if I would have been proactive last year and I said, hey, you're going to have $500,000 left over, why don't we set your salary at $500,000 a year? You're going to pay the same tax whether I call it a bonus or not. But in one scenario, you're going to get 60 cents on the dollar back. In the other scenario, you're going to get nothing. It's a great idea, right? So again, we want to make sure that for dealing with specified employees, we don't want to bonus them if we could salary them the information, but the accountant then has to be proactive. I can't sit there at the end of the year and say, oh, here's what your income is, bonus it like a normal CA. I have to think of next year. What's next year going to be, and be thinking that 1 year ahead to salary down the business limit instead of bonusing. So again, everything becomes a little more tricky when you're trying to optimize those things. Okay, getting to the heart of it. I'm going to go through these draft examples relatively quickly. So first we'll talk about a CRA software example. I was part of a stakeholders group in Mississauga. I'm not sure who really wrote this example or what the whole purpose of it was. Some CRA RTAs wrote this example up, got a whole bunch of us to go there, and then said, should this be an SR&ED project? And we said, well, I don't know, like it's so vague. They talk about that the tools that are developed really insulate programmers, these case tools or special tools that allow you to write the codes, so specialized that they fall short of the ever-growing needs of the user. Development work can be more complex because our tools fall short. In this case, we've got a company that's doing high-quality animation, and its objectives are to get fluid animation and interactivity on various web issues. They identify problems, constraints, bandwidth, transmission delays, peak loads, and their question is, could this be a technological advancement? What if they use open source software? Is that an effect? And what other components can maintain eligibility? And again, this is, I guess, good to solicit information or feedback, but really what the reviewers were saying is, see, this is the kind of information we get and why we have such a hard time. I'm not really interested in going to these things to listen to RTAs can convince me how hard it is. What we really need, and this is what kind of offends me, is an example of what could be R&D. I don't need examples of what's not R&D. There's an infinite number of examples of what's not R&D, and to waste my time to go to a stakeholders meeting to have them say, well, we don't even think this is R&D. We're just helping you to appreciate what a tough job it is to be an RTA. That's a complete waste of everyone's time. We should take this example and flip it out. Well, anyways, that's my personal opinion, right? I believe that the CRA has great basis to develop these examples, but there's really, and I'll say this, there's nobody in the CRA who really seems keen on making this happen. I've talked to the people that are in charge of it. The examples we're going to go through took almost 2 years from the point we announced it to get these out. I volunteered to help on it, but no one's going to let me be involved on that. Anyway, so what I did is I took their software example and I flushed it out here for anyone who's interested on how could this have been a very strong SR&ED project. How can we take the facts that they gave us, and then I went to clients who deal with all those kinds of issues and say there's all kinds of variables in here. Locking methods, scheduling methods, processes, how we organize information. All of these variables could drive activities which would be eligible. The example that they gave us, with a little bit of extra effort, could have been a great SR&ED example and say, here's what we're expecting. If you can meet this standard, you're eligible. Instead of, hey, here's something that we think is eligible and we don't know why. They're the RTA. I need direction from them on what's eligible, not what's not eligible. My clients don't care on what's not eligible. They just want the money in the minimum amount of time. All right, let's get into the recent release of the project examples. 10 examples here. I'm going to go through these really quick. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to read the whole example to you and then tell you what I think is good or bad about it, and then we can discuss it. So the first one is about pump redesign. So we talk about a chemical company that's developing a process. The pumps that they're using are supposed to last 10 years, but it starts quitting on them after 6 months. They replace the pump, and everything's resolved by that. So they say, well, that's just a standard practice solution. You got the company out, you replace the pump. So they're saying that's a problem, but it's got a routine solution. The pump wore out or something, and you replaced it. Case 2 is the pump wears out, they replace it, and 6 months later the pump quits again on them. It's supposed to last 10 years. So they have the pump manufacturer out, troubleshooting guide, found the failure was due to leak in the seal on the shaft of the pump, which allowed corrosive unit. Replaced the seals, failed again. Investigated further and found the temperature of the shaft after a prolonged period of operation exceeded maximum operating temperature. Cool. They found the failure of the seal was partly due to the design of the seal on the shaft, as well as the material. So right now, I'm saying, well, this is good. They're outlining the things I would say. Variables. Temperature of the shaft. The seal on the shaft, design. So design could be shape, it could be material, it could be a bunch of things, as well as the material. Okay? Under prolonged iteration, it failed. Once the cause was discovered, supplier began an experimental development program to find out which of several redesigns, so that's really the R&D, how do we redesign it, what were the variables, and seal materials would be compatible. So we got variables on the material itself, and then once we choose the material, the design, vice versa. If I choose a different material, that may affect my design. If I change my design, that may affect the ultimate material. So they collect data on the physical properties of the seal materials. They say there's no data available on the corrosive behavior. So again, avoiding standard practice. We went to get the solution. We did a reasonable search. We couldn't find any data. So again, what searches did you do is really the next level I would take it, that you couldn't find it. What was the closest thing that you found? Supplier, so they got experts here, investigated the material behavior. They're saying in this scenario, the pump supplier faces technological uncertainties, the design of the seal, and the material behavior. So they talk about this being the difference between a technical problem and a technology problem. Okay? Both are technical, but one deals with the how and why it works, and one just requires a skilled person to do a routine fix. So how I would outline this, if I was doing a description, is talk more about the due diligence. Not, hey, we did a search and nothing was found. Did you search hard enough? If my client said, I did a search and I couldn't find anything, well, how hard did you search? 1 minute, 10 minutes, an hour? How many things did you search? So flush that out. Objectives. They talk about maximum operating temperature. So they're already given one, but there's probably more. Cost, other kinds of issues in relation to that. Whoop, sorry. Okay? The variables in here are the seal design. So shape, thickness, things like that. And the design itself could have multiple variables within it, as well as the material itself. And then lastly, how many alternatives do we look at to get to the answer? And I'm saying that it's nice that they've picked one situation here, but it doesn't show the full project. And if you just look at one variable in isolation, like advancement or uncertainty, it really gives you the wrong skew. I don't think it's a safe thing to look at just one issue because they're completely interrelated. I can't talk about technological uncertainty unless I've talked about standard practice, because technological uncertainty can't exist unless I've benchmarked standard practice and gone beyond it. They're completely interrelated. Okay? Oil seed extraction process. So in this example, they talk about they have this technology to take seeds, some kind of grain seeds, and separate the oil out of them. They're talking about that they use a solvent to recover the meal and separate the oil. They use a process of toasting and distillation. The main limitation, they're saying, is that the conditions require high heat, 80 to 100 degrees Celsius, which harms the oil and the flours, so that it's no longer edible for human consumption. So the problem is how to separate the seed coats at a lower temperature. Perfect. So I'm saying that seems like a good project. They're saying that although there are several different technologies, none were readily applicable to the market. They had to try it on a small scale using something called ultrasonic macineration. So they had a new technique that they're saying maybe we can use this in here. However, there was no publicly available information on how to use this for this particular type of product. So again, they're giving all the information that we need to lay out a real project description. Okay? They didn't know whether a continuous process on a large scale would work, so there's scale-up issues. Just because we get the small prototype working, there could be variables on how to scale it up. And CRA says there was uncertainty on developing the continuous methods at low temperatures because no one knew if the objective could be achieved, scientific, or how to achieve it, system. So again, I'm saying that in this, ideally we'd want to talk about the objectives, the temperature, maybe the cost of the machine, maybe reclamation efficiency, maybe the purity of the oil. Do we have contaminant in there? There could be a lot of objectives which are relevant that they haven't mentioned here, but that the engineer is going to have to deal with to make this work, that are going to cause problems if they don't address it. So the variables that they talk about, the ultrasonic macineration, within that, there's probably lots of variables on the control parameters and choices within there to do that. The key operating parameters, maybe the solvent extracting method, what methods you use, and a change in any one of these could affect the others. So again, a good basis, I'm saying, it's not a bad project, but a good basis for a thorough project, a complete project, which would be more representative, in my view, than just trying to hit one issue out of a project or do a third of a project and hope that people can fill in the blanks. Here's one on cost constraints. So they're talking about a process for doing HVAC, where they want to develop a recirculation system to basically take carbon monoxide out and turn it into CO2. That there's a high-cost solution that uses a platinum catalyst, but that costs too much money. There's other methods, but they don't work at room temperature. So the objective here is how do we convert CO to CO2 at room temperature and keep the cost down at the same time. So again, perfect. This is typically how a project works. And they're outlining it, saying that although the cost target is not in and of itself a technological uncertainty, when you stack up the other objectives with it, it creates a basis for the technological uncertainty. Okay? So again, I talk about cost targets, conversion temperatures, any other stuff, and then really expand into what are my options of the variables on how to convert that CO to CO2 at room temperature. This next one, I find intellectually a little tricky. That basically, when you have a greenhouse, so I develop a new seed, maybe I own Macintosh apples, or maybe I own some progeny, or I want to buy that from the Monsanto, whoever owns the rights, so I can grow it. What I really want to do is say, okay, now that I've got this type of plant or whatever that I'm going to grow, how do I get the best yield? So what they talk about is techniques to optimize the yield. So they'll make the adjustments to factors such as lighting, temperature, CO2, humidity, nutrient levels, de-leafing operations. These, again, are variables that you could tweak to make more production, get 5 or 10% more yield, let's say, per acre or something like that. What this CRA is saying now is this whole industry, and after this example, there's not going to be any claims in there that anything you do in this industry is standard practice. that everything on greenhousing is pretty much a mature science, that you already have the formulas and you're just fine-tuning them. You're not really making any advancement in that. I'm saying, even though on a scientific level they've got all the variables, they outlined 8 variables there, that they're saying we have no model that can predict it, CRA is saying, we don't care, that whole industry's dead. It's written off. I'm saying, if they can do that, that's it. The whole greenhouse industry is killed right there. No more SR&ED by this one example. What if they release another one that's saying machinery is the same way? We can start to shut down whole industries with one example like this. And what I'm worried about is the way the RTAs approach these is they approach these as the Bible. If you have an example that's eligible, that parallels your work, it's always in. If you have an example that may be great SR&ED but parallels something like this where they say it's not in, it's not ever going to be in no matter what. It doesn't matter on the science. You can't argue anymore because there's a predisposition. So again, I find these kinds of situations without proper explanation a little bit dangerous. Well, I'm going to keep my personal opinions on that to myself, but we've got till November 18th for you to submit your comments to the CRA on what you like or dislike about each of these projects. So I'm talking about my examples, but I encourage everyone to write their own response, right? Because, again, these are just drafts, and the people who drafted them made it very clear that they're not saying this is written in stone. They're completely open to these kinds of constructive input and criticism. Okay. So, again, the objectives here are yield, but we could probably flush a lot more out. But like I say, they've got the variables, the CO2, whatever. This, to me, seems to fit the model of SR&ED. You know? The only thing is they're saying it's routine. But if they said it, they could apply the same rules to Northwest Hydraulics. Hey, you guys know everything there is to make a dam. There's nothing could ever be problem to you. And what the courts have said is you're holding, because someone is so skilled, you're holding them to a standard of excellence that's unreasonable, saying that they're not, because they're so brilliant, nothing could ever challenge them, even when they're very specific about what they don't know. So again, I think the science should drive the claim. If the science is there, CRA should have a rebuttal presumption. They should have to rebut it. Glue formulation. This is actually a very good one. I like this one. So they talk about a chemist who comes up with a new company. He comes across a project, and he's going to use a new additive that's been developed as a bonding agent. So he came across some new supplier, said, hey, we've developed some new agent that never existed before, and maybe you could use it. So those are always good indications. When it's a new material that didn't exist, chances are we're beyond standard practice. So they're saying he thinks it might help the new product work better. However, he's unsure of the conditions, temperature, pressure, humidity, under which to use it. So I'm saying this is good. I got 3 variables there. At least I'm in the right ballpark. There was no way of predicting whether the additive would work under the conditions manufactured. The hypothesis was that the 2 chemicals used in the research paper could be used in the right conditions. Okay? And what they're saying is this is great evidence of a hypothesis. I would tend to agree that he talked about standard practice, and then the hypothesis is, given the right combinations of the additive, the timing, the humidity, and pressure, and we're not sure what those are, but changing the pressure could change the optimal humidity, and vice versa. You'd have to model that and determine what that interrelation is, that the objectives like bond strength and cost could be achieved. And there may be other objectives. So again, I think this is a great start to a potentially great project description, but it's still lacking a little bit. In food development, we've got a trial and error example here. So what we have is a company that wants to prepare pizza products, right? A low-calorie product. So the first one is they use different amounts of sauce, reduce the amount of cheese, replace regular pepperoni with low-fat turkey pepperoni without changing the layer. This doesn't work because the pepperoni burned. Next, they change the order of the layers. This failed because the pepperoni was undercooked. Next, they reduce the size of the pepperoni by half. Still doesn't work. And finally, they reduce the thickness of the pepperoni, and this was successful. And they're saying, there's variables here, but it was trial and error because It's all just results. This worked, this didn't work, this worked, this didn't work. The difference between systematic investigation, and I completely agree, and trial and error is the conclusion. Under one, you get a result. And this happens a lot in business. A lot of people just want to meet the customer's need. They don't care why. Hey, if I got a product that works, let's sell it and move on to the next job. They don't spend that extra 5 minutes to say, why do I think this particular combination worked better than the others? This is one of the ones that I think they should build into case 1 and 2. Under this scenario, maybe it's not, but had the client done a little more, it could be back in. So again, I think that would be a nice illustrative example to claimants about why is a project in and why is it out? Because this is the reality that's faced by most claimants that are doing R&D or SR&D, but are weak on one or more areas of the documentation. Okay? So the variables could be ingredient selection, ordering, size and shape, any number of things in there. Okay? You don't want to keep all your evidence in your head. The worst ones are the guys that are prototype guys that say, here's my 7 prototypes, and when CRA says, where's your notes or hypothesis or whatever, they say, hey, all up here. What do you want to know? Okay? Because nobody's memory is that perfect. Okay, potato peeler. We'll go through this fast. Case 1 is pretty easy. That a potato peeler, this is a good one, standard practice, hasn't changed for around 100 years, and what they want to do is they want to make a glow-in-the-dark handle. There's no change to the shape of the handle or the blade. They basically just took a glow-in-the-dark material and replaced it. And they're saying, well, that's a cool new product, but that's not technological advancement. Glow-in-the-dark materials have been around for a long time, and you haven't told us anything special about molding process or anything. It's all routine. So I'd agree. That's a case of routine. They're saying case 2 is they want to do this with a blade, make it easier to use, easier to grip, etc. So they got objectives here that we could quantify. They want to make it softer and get rigid enough to retain its shape, and surfaces would have to be rough enough to prevent slipping. So again, more quantifiable objectives, roughness, slip, whatever, grip strength, have to be dishwasher safe. Could not be satisfied with any plastic available at the time and just decided to use a new polymer. So now we say, okay, that's what's new. There's the departure from standard practice. No existing off-the-shelf solution from what we tried. Hopefully they did enough due diligence and we're in there. They encounter, when they're developing a new handle, they encounter difficulties in the injection molding process using the new polymer. The working temperature had to be much higher than what they traditionally used. They had to develop the injection molding process to produce desired physical properties, and they acquired the know-how. Now again, they kind of skimmed over the real crux or the real issues in there that could be fleshed out, but I think this is still a good basis for a potential project if they took it a little step further. I don't think that you want to just have a little shot of parts of the project. It's best to show the whole project. From start, standard practice, objectives, right through the variables, experimentation, results, conclusions. So again, objectives could be, number of dishwasher cycles, cost, roughness, micro inches, area roughness, profile roughness. There's all kinds of ways to measure the parameters that they're talking about if you're a scientist. So right away, it'll become clear when I look at the objectives, only scientists or technical people write like this. If it's will people buy it, stuff like those are laymen. They're not going to be able to do science. Usually just from looking at these criteria, I can tell if there's someone skilled in the art or if it's someone who doesn't really know what they're doing, who's just doing routine or standard practice. Getting on to the last couple. Hockey stick design. So what we have here is a company that has to develop a new hockey stick process. They supply the world market. They're going to do experimental development work because they want to scan and cut and rasp the hockey stick using a single machine. Okay? They use statistical sampling to say that they need to do 500 sticks to get the outer tolerance sticks with a 95% confidence interval. So they get an order for 2,000 sticks, and the ruling is that only the cost of the first 500, which was statistically needed to answer the technological uncertainties, is in for the SR&D, and the cost of the other 1,500 that they had to produce to meet the customer's order, which wasn't necessary, is in. And I think this is a great example. They could expand more on the issues, but they're trying to illustrate the sample size issue. What I find is this is a huge issue. on every eligible project, particularly where they're selling the end production. Is it commercial or is it experimental? And companies like GE subsidiaries that use Six Sigma quality standards, and they talk about confidence intervals and tolerances, they can claim huge, huge sample sizes and sell it all. Whereas other guys who are less sophisticated, who don't know how to use statistical sampling and stuff, could do 50 prototypes, and CRA could say, hey, why didn't you just do 5? And they're going to lose every time. Being able to support statistical sample size like a scientist would, understanding confidence intervals, tolerances, is huge. If these guys didn't do it, you know what the sample size would be? It wouldn't be 500. It would be 5 sticks. I'm telling you from experience. If you can't justify sample size like a scientist, you're going to get your claim whittled down. The other big thing is all of the labor costs for those sticks would be eligible, but I would argue that all the material costs would not be, because I'm assuming they sold the sticks and the material was used in the experimentation temporarily, but it wasn't consumed. The access to material has to be consumed, rendered valueless. We used it in the experiment, but then we sold it. We got paid for it. People are using the sticks. So it wasn't consumed. It's only our labor to run it and test this that we would claim, none of the material costs. Yes? You're right. If you scrapped it, you could claim those costs for sure. So some of the things here are objectives on tolerance, production rate, reject rates, whatever. They should try to pull those out to show the claimant how to do it, right? The variables aren't really strong. Laser position, type of, I'm not really sure what the uncertainties are here, but I get the idea on sample size. I'm saying, again, looking at just parts of a project is hard because you want to look at the full. Okay? Chemical formulation. This is an easy one. And again, most data collection scenarios are pretty clear. If you can define what the problem is, the data collection's in. If you can't correlate the data collection to a problem, it's out. So he talks about a chemical plan where a lab technologist takes samples throughout the process as part of the quality control, let's say, every day. Right? In case 1, they use this historical data collected to use it on an SR&ED project. Okay? So they're saying that the daily data collection that's not aimed at an uncertainty is just routine. Even if a year later you can use that data to answer a technical question, you already collected it. It's only data you collect from the point you define the problem and collect additional data. So now they're saying that the data is still being collected. Here, however, the researchers also asked by the lab technologists to collect specific samples and run specific tests over and above the routine work to deal with a specific issue. So again, they're saying that when the data is aimed at a specific issue, it's in. I think that's a pretty clear example. What we could do is take this example and actually flesh it out to provide all the other issues, not illustrate just that one point. Lastly, electronic products, so business portion of the project. What we're talking about here is that a company has a new electronic product. They want to develop it further, but they want to miniaturize things. So during the development, a problem arose with the size of the component in relation to the existing product. Knowledge of miniaturization in the field of microelectronics was required to fit the new product, and the company didn't possess that knowledge. So they go out and they contract someone to do the miniaturization work. Here's where they assume the whole project way. The contractor performed SR&ED work on behalf of the company. Work succeeded, and they reduced the size of the component. They're saying that only the part of the development on the miniaturization there was in, not the development of the entire project. Okay? So they talk about the business project and the SR&ED project within it. I'm saying in reality, they had a great opportunity here to say this happens all the time. And the real problem with hiring a subcontractor is that typically they report results to the client. They don't tell them about all their uncertainty. The client doesn't care about that. They're like, build me the product that I want. I don't care what your problems are. Just keep the cost down. So ultimately, if we don't get that information from them, how do we know we did SR&ED? My whole point is, we probably, to file an SR&ED claim, we probably need to talk to the specialist about why it was SR&ED, and they kind of skimmed over that whole part in the example. So again, I would try to maybe flush that out too, that they should go ask the guy and get him to document what his SR&ED was and give an example of what would be in. Okay. All right. I've given a quick overview of RFI, but we've already pretty much talked about all those. So detailed of each activity, including number of hours claimed for each individual person per activity per month. Contemporaneous information and evidence, recorded the due diligence, recognized the advancements, preserve the new knowledge gained for the company. So again, that's your conclusions. A lot of companies, if they don't have that, are going to be pushed to do it. Time records of the employee in SR&ED and time records to support time spent by the employee in SR&ED and non-SR&ED activities. So some method about how you differentiated that. Ideally, I'd say SR&ED correlates to the variables or uncertainties, and non-SR&ED doesn't. Okay. We talked about the new preparer fees, so I won't go into too much detail on that. Starting January 1. We talked about dispute resolution already, so I won't spend too much time talking about that. But basically, your 30 days, your 180, and then really Tax Court of Canada or now informal appeal is a great time frame. To wrap it up, this is, I got a whole bunch of questions of people when I sent the agenda out. I'm not exactly sure what this one means, but I get the general deal. They say, quote, I have a question in relation to conducting SR&ED in regulated industries. The old IC comments that work in this area, 7.4 and 7.5, is eligible because we assume that a scientific or technological uncertainty must resolve to the satisfaction of the authorities. They're saying in a recent situation, we were advised by the Science and Technology Advisor that this wording had been omitted from the new online version of the policy, and as a result, the policy was changed. So you had a claimant who's successfully claiming every year, and now these new policy papers came out, and they said because this old information from the IC, it didn't make it to the new one, the policy's changed. I'm saying, well, that's a concern to me because the policy statement says there's no changes. Everything's the same as normal. We've just removed the ambiguities. But now we've got claimants coming back saying, no, the things that are missing are not ambiguities anymore. They're a change in policy. So again, I'll have to see and find out more information on this, but it'd be interesting to find out more about how these things change, or if certain other omissions are going to result in a change in policy. I've already run into a few. One of the ones that I've seen is, CRA used to have a policy where they said that if you file a claim within 3 months, so by the 15-month deadline, you give them 90 days to review it, they should have sufficient time to allow you to fill in the blanks if something's missing. The new policy says, hey, if they happen to review it before the deadline, they'll give you the chance. But it doesn't say, hey, if you submit it by the 15 months and you're missing something, you got a second chance. They're saying, hey, if we take 5 months to get to it because we were busy, that's tough luck for you. Now you lose everything. So again, I'm saying, has the policy changed? It seems very different from the old one when I read it. I'm not going to really know till something like this happens, but it seems to me like a change in policy. It doesn't seem like the same policy. So again, I'm going to have to write to the guys in Ottawa and say, well, what's really going on here? Because that could be very significant. It could be a huge lawsuit against me if something like that goes wrong, especially if I'm negligent in some way. I didn't tick something or fill something up properly. Right? They then, also the new policy paper adds to the list of prescribed forms. So they're saying if you're filing at 18 months and any one of these things is missing, or it's not completely filled out, every single box, if anything's missing on any of these forms, you haven't filed all prescribed information in prescribed form. So it used to be just the 661 and Schedule 31. And now they're saying, and any forms related to it. So if we have non-arm's length cost, you have to file the 1145, 1146 forms. If you forgot that and you're past 18 months, you lose the entire claim. If I have a specified employee that's being paid wages out of different companies, I have to file a T1174 form. If I don't, I just lost the entire claim. If I have a payment to a third party and I didn't file my 1263, I just lost it again. I didn't lose that cost. I lost everything. Better yet, if we have associated companies and I didn't file Schedule 49 to allocate the expenditure limit, I lost the entire claim for all the companies. So again, this is very onerous. It's a huge liability for preparers, and it's actually increased. So you combine the fact that the requirements have increased, and they've kind of pulled out the caveat of the 15 months, it's really created a lot more liability for practitioners like ourselves, in my opinion. One of the other ones that I've seen pop up is what's called entitlement to exploit. So the old IC used to say, this requirement is considered to be met in cases where the taxpayer has the right to use a patent that results from the SR&ED project, even if the taxpayers charge a royalty or similar fee for the patent. It's also considered to be met where the taxpayer is entitled to distribute or market any product that results from the SR&ED. I've had reviewers come out to clients and say, no, you have to own all the rights. If you don't own all the rights, you can't claim. That seems to be a huge change in policy. The old policy was very clear, and now there's no mention of this anymore. There's nothing about entitlement to exploit. So I'm saying, is that purposefully omitted? Is it a change in policy, or was that just an accident that that was omitted? Because it's being enacted, or it's being, in the field, it's being treated as a change in policy. All right, any other questions? Sorry, I went a little over time there, but a lot of issues. Dominic, did you want to add anything on the end of that? Oh, yeah, you're right. We got to stop because we're on a webcast, so let me just deal with the questions, and then we'll turn the thing off. Yes. The way it works is like this. If you file a notice of objection, it stays with CRA. And it's getting better. Because what used to happen, is, the big joke that we had is it's a total waste of time to file an objection in SRED because it always goes back to the same guy who wrote the original report. It doesn't get an independent second review. It's always back to the guy who said, look, I already ruled on this. You didn't get it. Why are you objecting? It never did anything. Now, everything's going through Mississauga, and it looks like there's going to be different reviewers. I don't know. The new process might be better. But the rule is you have to file the objection. You have to wait at least 90 days for the CRA to respond. They're not going to respond within 90 days. And then you can either wait for them to respond, or you can say, I'm not waiting for them. Now you can file either the general procedure or the informal procedure to the Tax Court of Canada. As soon as you go to the Tax Court of Canada, CRA has nothing to do with it. You can't go back down, basically. Once you go to the Tax Court of Canada, it's out of CRA's hands. Now you're appointed a Crown Counsel from the Department of Justice, which, if you're following the law, is great, because these people are they're not going to read ITs or ICs or policy papers. They don't care. They're going to read the Act, they're going to read tax court cases, and they're going to follow only what the courts say. They don't care about any CRA documents. So, again, if you have a strong legal case, that's your best method. If you go CRA objection, they don't read the Income Tax Act or cases. They only read their own policy papers. And if I say if the policy paper is ambiguous on it or lacking, they're not going to change their opinion. That's my experience. Yeah. It depends if it's a technical issue or a financial issue. I would tend to agree. Usually the people with the knowledge of the tax law don't know about the science. So what they really do, or they should do, is, like we said, the expert's role is not to decide whether it's advancement or not, but to provide the lawyer, the Crown Counsel in this case, with the evidence for them to make an informed decision, whether they benchmark standard practice, technical objectives. And they're smart people. I mean, they're not scientists, but they can apply those criteria relatively freely if both scientists are willing to provide the information to them to see if it fits or not. Yes? No, the technical notes say that the new procedures occurred earlier of when you file, or the later of when you file or when it gets royal assent, right? So if you file before royal assent, you're stuck at the 12,000. That's why I was saying that if the legislation passes like last year, it's usually, March budget, October, it'll get royal assent. So yeah, by October or November, it could already be passed. That's what I'm saying. If I got something sitting there, I might just sit and wait a month or two. If it takes a long time, you can always go ahead and do it. But I think we're really at that cusp where it could come through quickly. Yeah, go ahead, Harvey. The informal appeal limits. So, and it may not get passed. I'm betting on by the end of this year, but like I say, you may not want to wait. Any other issues or questions? All right, guys.